Chapter 4. Death by Drowning. The morning sun filtered through unfamiliar curtains, and Eleanor Henderson's hand reached automatically for the lamp that wasn't there. For 3 disorienting seconds, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came rushing back. The water, the darkness, Connor's face above her, the impossible fact of her resurrection. She was in Connor's guest room, in his farmhouse, 3 miles outside Millbrook, and she was supposed to be dead. Eleanor sat up slowly, her body responding normally, despite the cosmic wrongness of its existence. She examined her hands in the pale light. The same age spots, the same crooked pinky from a childhood break, the same wedding ring she'd worn for 43 years before Robert's death. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The guest suite Connor had installed her in was surprisingly comfortable. A large bedroom with attached bathroom, decorated in neutral tones that suggested a professional designer rather than Connor's own taste. A vase of fresh roses sat on the dresser, and Eleanor wondered if Connor had thought to buy them, or if it was simply habit. How many guests had occupied this room? How many had been dead women given a second chance at life? She forced herself out of bed, going through the motions of her morning routine with the deliberate precision of someone clinging to normalcy. Shower, dress in the clothes Connor had brought her yesterday, sizes remarkably accurate. She'd have to ask how he'd managed that. Brush her hair. The woman in the mirror looked exactly like Eleanor Henderson, 78 years old, retired English teacher. Nothing in her reflection suggested she'd drowned 3 days ago. The smell of coffee drew her downstairs. Connor's farmhouse was larger than it appeared from the outside. Rooms branching off from the main hall in a warren that spoke of centuries of additions and renovations. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed in his usual button-down shirt and khakis, reading something on his tablet while eggs cooked on the stove. "Good morning," he said without looking up. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been pulled from the river and told I can never go home," Eleanor said, pouring herself coffee. "So, perfectly fine, all things considered." Connor glanced at her, and she caught something like approval in his expression. "You're handling this better than most would." "What choice do I have?" Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, wrapping her hands around the mug. "I can fall apart or I can adapt. I've always been practical, Dr. McMasters. Death isn't going to change that." "Connor, please, I think we're past formalities." Eleanor nodded, though using his first name felt strange. For 15 years, he'd been Dr. McMasters. Professional, slightly distant, the town physician who made house calls and remembered everyone's medical history with uncanny precision. Now, he was Connor, the necromancer who'd violated the laws of nature to save her life. The shift in their relationship was dizzying. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Connor cooked well, another skill accumulated across centuries, Eleanor supposed. As she finished her eggs, she began the day's interrogation. "How does it work?" she asked. "The necromancy. What exactly did you do to me?" Connor set down his fork. "What would you like to know?" "Everything." Eleanor leaned forward. "Start with the basics. Am I alive or something else?" "You're alive," Connor said. "Your heart beats, your cells divide. You'll age normally and eventually die again. I didn't create an illusion or a puppet. I called your spirit back and rebound it to your body before decomposition could begin." "But how?" Connor was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming on the table in a nervous habit Eleanor had never seen before. "I don't fully understand it myself," he admitted. "Necromancy isn't like other magic. It doesn't follow rules I can articulate. It's intuitive. I reach out with something that isn't quite touch. I find the thread of a spirit that hasn't travelled too far, and I pull. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't." "How often does it work?" "About 70% of the time. If I reach the body within 6 hours. Less if longer." Eleanor absorbed this. "Have you done it often?" "No." Connor stood, clearing their plates. 43 times over the years, including you." "Why so few?" "Because it's dangerous," Connor said, his back to her as he washed dishes. "Every resurrection risks exposure. And because—" he paused. "Because bringing someone back means explaining what they've become. It means watching them realize they can never truly resume their lives. It means bearing responsibility for their second chance." Eleanor heard the weight in his voice, the burden of impossible choices accumulated out across lifetimes. Do you regret saving me? Connor turned to face her. No. Ian Martin murdered you for money. That injustice demanded correction. Even if it means I'm trapped in your guest room indefinitely? You're not trapped. You're hidden. There's a difference. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Connor was right. She was hidden, protected, given space to adjust. Trapped would come later, when the reality of her permanent isolation truly sank in. The days developed a rhythm. Connor left each morning for his medical practice in town, and Eleanor had the farmhouse to herself. At first, she simply wandered, exploring rooms filled with accumulated centuries. Connor's home was a museum of personal history, books in dozens of languages, furniture from different eras, photographs in frames that predated photography itself. Paintings, Eleanor realised, miniatures from the Renaissance. But Eleanor had never been comfortable with idleness. By the third day, she'd begun organising the chaos of Connor's guest wing. The linen closet was reorganised by size and season. The spare bedroom that served as a storage room was sorted, catalogued, and rendered actually functional. When Connor returned home to find her elbow deep in his disaster of a filing system, he looked more amused than annoyed. "You can't help yourself, can you?" he asked. "Idle hands make for idle minds," Eleanor said primly. "Besides, when did you last balance your household accounts? I found bills from 2011 mixed in with your recent mail. I have a system. Your system is chaos." Eleanor held up a folder labelled important, maybe. "This is not organisation, Connor. This is procrastination with filing folders." He laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "Fine. Reorganise whatever you want. Just don't throw anything away without asking." Eleanor attacked the project with the fervour of someone desperate for purpose. She created systems, implemented order, and transformed Connor's administrative nightmare into something approaching functionality. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, which was crucial because the alternative was dwelling on what she'd lost. She couldn't call her friends. Marjorie and Susan were probably frantic with worry, and Eleanor ached to reassure them. She couldn't visit Robert's grave, couldn't tend the roses she'd planted there 5 years ago. She couldn't check on her house, couldn't retrieve the photo albums in her attic, couldn't finish the quilt she'd been making for her grandniece. Her entire life sat 3 miles away, tantalizingly close and absolutely unreachable. The grief came in waves, usually when she least expected it. She'd be folding laundry and suddenly remember she'd never fold her own sheets again. She'd be reading and realise she couldn't recommend the book to Susan. She'd hear a song on Connor's radio and remember dancing to it with Robert 40 years ago. And the loss would hit her like a physical blow. Connor found her crying in the guest room one evening, surrounded by the clothes he'd bought her. Practical, neutral pieces that fit well, but weren't hers. They weren't the vintage dresses she loved, the scarves Robert had given her, the earrings her daughter had made. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, wiping her eyes. "This is ridiculous. I'm alive, which is more than I should be. I shouldn't be crying about clothes." Connor sat beside her on the bed. "You're not crying about clothes. You're grieving your life. I'm being ungrateful. You're being human." He handed her a tissue. "Eleanor, you died. You came back. But the life you had is gone. That deserves grief." Eleanor blew her nose inelegantly. "Do you ever get used to it? The loss?" "No," Connor said quietly. "You just learn to carry it." They sat in silence for a while, and Eleanor felt the shift in their relationship deepen. They were no longer doctor and patient, or even host and guest. They were two people displaced from their proper lives, keeping each other company in the margins of existence. But Eleanor's grief had a sharper edge than simple loss. In her quieter moments, standing at the guest room window and looking toward town, toward her Victorian house on the hill, she found herself consumed not by sadness, but by rage. Ian Martin hadn't just killed her. He'd calculated her worth and found it less valuable than his bank account. He'd looked at 78 years of life, her teaching career, her marriage, her friendships, her contributions to Millbrook, and decided it was acceptable collateral damage in his pursuit of profit. That cold arithmetic infuriated her more than the act of murder itself. Eleanor had been a teacher for 40 years. She'd shaped young minds, encouraged struggling students, celebrated academic victories. She'd been a wife, a friend, a pillar of the community. She'd mattered. And Ian had erased all of that because she wouldn't sell her house. "Tell me again about him," Eleanor said to Connor one night over dinner. "Ian Martin, what have you learned?" Connor set down his fork, and Eleanor recognised the look on his face. He'd been waiting for this question. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Eleanor said. "I want to know exactly who killed me and why." Connor's investigation revealed a man circling the drain. Ian Martin, 42 years old, had come to Millbrook 5 years ago with big plans and bigger debts. His real estate business had started strong. He'd flipped 3 properties in the first year, making decent profit. But Ian's ambitions exceeded his capital, and he'd begun leveraging debt to acquire properties, betting on perpetual market growth. "He's underwater," Connor explained, showing Eleanor the financial records he'd obtained through methods Eleanor decided not to examine too closely. "His business account is overdrawn, he's behind on his own rent, and his credit cards are maxed. He needs a significant influx of cash, or he's facing bankruptcy and possible criminal charges for check fraud." "So he killed me for my house," Eleanor said flatly. "Yes, your property is worth approximately $1,200,000. If he could acquire it below market value and flip it quickly, he'd clear enough to satisfy his immediate creditors and buy himself time." Eleanor studied Ian's photograph. Connor had printed it from the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce website. Ian looked like any other middle-aged businessman. Thinning hair, forced smile, expensive suit that didn't quite fit right. Nothing in his face suggested he was capable of murder. "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I continue gathering evidence," Connor said. "When we're ready, we'll expose him." "How?" "I'm dead, Connor. I can't testify against him." "There are other ways." Connor's expression was hard. "I've been watching Ian. He's unraveling. Desperate men make mistakes." Eleanor wanted to ask what Connor had planned, but she wasn't sure she wanted to know. There was something ancient and cold in his voice. Something troubled her. Instead, she asked, "Have you ever killed someone? A human?" Connor met her eyes. "Yes, when it was necessary to protect myself or others. Does that bother you?" Eleanor considered. "No," she said finally. "I think I'm past being bothered by moral ambiguity. Ian Martin murdered me for money. Whatever happens to him now, he's earned." Connor nodded slowly. "Good, because what I have planned won't be gentle." That night, Eleanor lay awake in the guest room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Connor's farmhouse. Somewhere in the darkness, Ian Martin was sleeping peacefully in his condo, believing he'd gotten away with murder. He had no idea that his victim was alive, cataloguing his sins, waiting for justice. Eleanor smiled grimly in the dark. She'd always been patient. She could wait a little longer. Connor had perfected the art of invisible investigation over his long life. He moved through Millbrook like a shadow, present but unremarkable, gathering information with the patient efficiency of someone who understood that time was his greatest advantage. He started with public records. The Millbrook Town Clerk's office knew him well. Dr. McMasters, who'd been practicing medicine in town for... how long had it been? 15 years? 20? The clerk could never quite remember, which was precisely how Connor preferred it. He requested property records going back 7 years, citing a historical interest in town development. The clerk was happy to help. The records told a story. Ian Martin had started aggressively acquiring properties 3 years ago, targeting elderly homeowners with a pattern of psychological manipulation. He'd approach them repeatedly, wearing them down with visits and phone calls. He'd make lowball offers, then slowly increase them while emphasizing the burden of property maintenance, the risk of housing market collapse, the wisdom of liquidating assets before health declined. Most of his targets had eventually sold. Connor recognized several names, patients he'd treated, people he'd known. Mrs. Robertson, who'd sold her family home 6 months before dying in a nursing home. Mr. Chan, who'd relocated to live with his daughter in Boston. The Kowalski brothers, who'd split the money and moved to Florida. All legitimate sales. But Connor saw the coercion beneath. Ian was a predator who'd identified vulnerable prey and systematically harvested them. Eleanor's name appeared in the records with increasing frequency over the past year. Ian had approached her officially 7 times, though Connor knew from Eleanor's accounts that unofficial visits and chance encounters had been far more numerous. She'd refused every offer, and her last response to Ian's lawyer had included the phrase, "over my dead body." Ian had taken that literally. Connor photographed the relevant pages with his phone, then moved to less official channels. Information in small towns flowed most freely in casual settings, and Connor had learned centuries ago that gossip was often more valuable than official records. Millie's coffee shop was ground zero for Millbrook gossip. Connor timed his visit for mid-morning after the breakfast rush, but before lunch, when the regulars gathered to dissect town news. He ordered his usual coffee, black, no sugar, and settled at a corner table with a medical journal, apparently absorbed, but actually listening to every conversation around him. Betty Chen was holding court near the window, her voice carrying across the shop. Betty worked at Millbrook First National Bank and possessed both extensive financial knowledge and an inability to keep secrets. Connor had learned more about the town's fiscal health from Betty's indiscretions than from any official source. "I'm just saying," Betty stage whispered to her audience of 3 other women, "that man is drowning in debt. Bounced 3 checks last month alone. His business account shows more red than black, if you know what I mean." Connor's attention sharpened, though his eyes never left his journal. "Who are we talking about?" asked Marjorie Patterson, Eleanor's friend. Connor realised with a pang. Marjorie looked tired, her eyes red from crying. Eleanor's drowning had been discovered 5 days ago, and the town was still processing the tragedy. "Ian Martin," Betty said, "the real estate developer. Between you and me, that man is facing foreclosure on his own condo. Can you imagine selling houses but can't pay for his own?" "Karma," someone muttered. Connor filed away the information. Ian was more desperate than Connor had realised. That made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable. Over the next week, Connor became Ian Martin's invisible shadow. He observed from a distance, careful never to be noticed, but always present. He sat 2 tables away at the River's Edge pub during Ian's liquid lunch. 3 martinis, Connor counted, finished by 1:30 p.m. He jogged past Ian's office during his morning runs, noting when Ian arrived, usually late, and how he looked progressively worse. He attended the Chamber of Commerce meeting where Ian gave a presentation about revitalising Millbrook through smart development, his hands shaking slightly as he clicked through slides about properties he no longer owned and projects he couldn't afford to begin. Ian didn't notice him particularly. Connor was just the town doctor, a fixture of Millbrook's landscape, as unremarkable as the post office or the church steeple. But Connor noticed everything. Ian wore expensive clothes, designer labels, tailored suits, but they were beginning to show wear. His shoes were cheap, scuffed. His watch was a knockoff Rolex that Connor's centuries-trained eye recognised immediately. Ian was performing prosperity he no longer possessed, and the facade was cracking. Connor watched Ian check his phone obsessively, flinching at texts, declining calls. He saw Ian drink his lunch, then pop breath mints before afternoon meetings. He observed the muscle in Ian's jaw that twitched when someone mentioned money or property or deadlines. Connor recognised desperation. He'd seen it in countless faces across centuries. Cornered people were dangerous because they had nothing to lose, but they were also predictable because fear narrowed options and accelerated mistakes. Connor engineered a casual encounter outside Millbrook Pharmacy. Ian was picking up a prescription, sleeping pills, Connor noted, and looked haggard, his eyes shadowed and red-rimmed. "Ian," Connor called, approaching with manufactured concern. "Are you all right? You look exhausted." Ian startled, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. McMasters, I'm fine. Just busy season. You know how it is." "I do," Connor said sympathetically. "But you should take care of yourself. Stress can manifest in serious health problems. If you need something to help you sleep, I can prescribe." "I'm fine," Ian interrupted, his voice sharp. Then, realising his tone, he softened it artificially. "Really? I'm fine. Just a lot on my plate right now." "Well, if you need anything," Connor said, handing Ian his card. Unnecessary, since everyone in Millbrook had his number, but it completed the concerned doctor performance. "My door is always open." "Thanks," Ian said, already moving away, his shoulders tight with tension. Connor watched him go, satisfied. Ian was cracking. The guilt and fear were eating at him, just as Connor had known they would. Amateur murderers always broke under the weight of their crimes. It was simply a matter of time. Back at the farmhouse, Connor spread out his investigation across the dining room table. Financial records, property documents, timeline of Ian's movements, psychological profile. Eleanor wandered in, saw the organised chaos, and raised an eyebrow. "Is this how you work?" she asked. Connor looked up, surprised by her insight. "Yes," he admitted. "Know your enemy completely before you make your move." Eleanor studied the materials, her expression hardening as she read the financial records. He's not just desperate, he's in free fall. "Yes, which means he might try again," Eleanor said slowly. "If he got away with killing me, why wouldn't he solve his other problems the same way?" Connor had already reached the same conclusion. "I'm monitoring his movements. If he targets anyone else, I'll know." "And then what?" Connor met her eyes. "Then I stop him, permanently, if necessary." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Good." They stood together in silence, examining the evidence of Ian's moral collapse. Connor had hunted many monsters across the ages. Witch hunters who'd killed with religious righteousness, vampires who'd killed for sustenance, humans who'd killed for pleasure or profit. Ian Martin wasn't special. He was simply the latest monster who needed to be stopped. But as Connor returned to his analysis, something nagged at him. Ian's desperation was accelerating, not abating. The financial pressure was mounting daily. If Ian was going to kill again, it would be soon. Connor needed to move faster. Ian's office had become a temple to obsession. The large map of Millbrook covered most of one wall, coloured pins marking his campaign of acquisition. Red pins for properties successfully purchased, 23 of them, though most had been quickly flipped and the money was long gone. Yellow pins for negotiations in progress, only 2 now, both stalled by sellers having second thoughts. Blue pins for targets, properties Ian wanted but hadn't yet approached. And 1 black pin. Eleanor Henderson's Victorian house. Dead end, literally. Ian stood before the map with a glass of bourbon at 10 a.m., studying the constellation of pins, like a general planning a campaign. Except generals didn't murder their obstacles. Generals didn't drown 78-year-old women in bathtubs. The thought threatened to derail him, and Ian shoved it away with practiced force. He couldn't afford guilt. Guilt was a luxury for people who had choices, and Ian's choices had narrowed to a singular focus: survival. His phone buzzed with another text from his ex-wife's lawyer. Garnishment proceedings would begin in 30 days unless Ian paid $15,000 in back alimony. His landlord had texted yesterday, last chance before eviction proceedings. His credit card companies called hourly. The walls were closing in, and Ian's panic had metastasized into something colder and more calculating. The first murder had been horrifying. The moment when Eleanor's struggles had ceased, when Ian had seen the life leave her eyes, had been the worst moment of his life. He'd vomited in the bushes outside her house, shaking so violently he could barely drive home. He'd taken a sleeping pill and still hadn't slept, haunted by Eleanor's face. But the next morning, something had shifted. The world hadn't ended. The police hadn't arrived. The newspaper reported Eleanor's drowning as a tragic accident. Beloved retired teacher and principal. Taken too soon. Community in mourning. There was no investigation, no suspicion, just sympathy and sorrow. And Ian's problems had decreased by 1. He'd gotten away with it. The realization had hit him with the force of revelation. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross, but instead of consequences, he'd found solution. Eleanor Henderson had been an obstacle, and now she wasn't. Her property would eventually come to market, probably sold by distant relatives who wouldn't know its true value. Ian could acquire it at estate sale prices and flip it for substantial profit. Murder worked. The thought should have horrified him, but Ian's moral framework had shattered along with Eleanor's neck. He was too far past the point of redemption to waste time on self-recrimination. There was only forward now, only survival, only the next deal that would buy him more time. His eyes tracked across the map to a blue pin on Main Street. Thomas Grayson's property. Thomas Grayson, 65, Vietnam veteran, living alone in the 3-story Victorian he'd inherited from his parents. Prime commercial location, currently zoned residential, but easily changed. The building needed work, but the lot alone was worth $800,000 to the right developer. Ian had already researched potential buyers. A boutique hotel chain had expressed interest in Millbrook locations. Ian had approached Thomas twice already, testing the waters. The first time, Thomas had been polite, but non-committal. "I'll think about it," he'd said, which Ian had interpreted as soft refusal. The second approach had been more aggressive. Ian had emphasised the building's deterioration, the burden of maintenance, the financial wisdom of selling while the market was strong. Thomas had been less polite. "I said I'd think about it. That means no." Number. The word that had sealed Eleanor's fate. The word that was about to seal Thomas's. Ian began his research with the methodical focus of a predator. He learned Thomas's routines through observation and casual inquiry. Thomas was a creature of habit, his days predictable to the point of ritual. Morning coffee at the diner, reading the newspaper for exactly 45 minutes. Afternoon walk to the VFW hall, where he volunteered with other veterans. Evenings at home, watching television with the curtains open, Jeopardy at 7 p.m, the news at 8, some old movie afterward. Thomas was solitary. His wife had died 8 years ago, cancer. No children. A sister in California who visited rarely. Ian had confirmed this by chatting with the postal worker who delivered Thomas's mail. The sister sent birthday and Christmas cards, but that was the extent of her involvement in Thomas's life. Perfect. Isolated victim. Minimal connections. No one who'd push for investigation if something happened. Ian researched methods with the cold calculation of an engineer solving a problem. Drowning had worked with Eleanor, but it had been risky. The timing had been fortunate. If Connor McMasters hadn't been delayed, if anyone else had come by earlier, Eleanor might have been found and revived. Ian needed something more certain, more immediately fatal. Strangulation. Quick, relatively silent, and easily staged to look like a burglary gone wrong. Millbrook had experienced a rash of break-ins over the past 6 months, mostly minor thefts, garage doors left open, unlocked cars rifled through. But fear was irrational, and people were nervous. If Thomas surprised a burglar, if the situation escalated. Tragic, but understandable. Ian bought gloves from 3 different stores, paying cash. He purchased nylon rope from a hardware store in the next town over. He mapped the route from his condo to Thomas's house. 16 minutes through residential streets, most of them poorly lit. He noted which houses left porch lights on, where security cameras were mounted, which intersections had traffic lights with cameras. Thomas played poker every Thursday night at the VFW, a weekly ritual he'd maintained for 30 years. He always walked home around 9 p.m, slightly drunk, but steady enough to navigate the 6 blocks. He always entered through the back door. According to Ian's careful observation, Thomas often forgot to lock that back door, a vestige of Millbrook's safer past. Thursday night, a burglary, an accident, another problem solved. Ian worked through the plan obsessively, refining details, identifying risks, building contingencies. He researched police response times for residential burglary calls. He studied Thomas's house from multiple angles, timing how long it took to walk from the back door to the living room where Thomas always sat after returning from the VFW. As he planned, Ian constructed justifications. Thomas was old, probably wouldn't live more than another decade anyway. He was alone, likely unhappy, maybe even suicidal. Who could say? Ian wasn't really killing him. He was just reallocating resources to someone who needed them more. Thomas's property sitting idle was wasteful when Ian could use it productively. The greatest good for the greatest number, utilitarian ethics, survival of the fittest. The rationalizations were monstrous, and somewhere in Ian's fragmenting psyche, he knew it. But acknowledging the monstrosity meant acknowledging what he'd become, and that was unthinkable. Better to embrace the logic of necessity, to believe that circumstances had forced his hand, to imagine himself as victim rather than perpetrator. Thursday approached with the inevitability of judgment. Ian prepared with mechanical precision. Gloves, rope, dark clothes, the thrift store items. He reviewed his timeline, his route, his contingencies. He took a long shower, trying to wash away the anticipation dread coiling in his stomach. In the mirror, Ian Martin looked haggard, hunted, half mad. But his hands were steady. He could do this. He had to do this. Thomas Grayson would die, and Ian Martin would survive another day. Thursday night settled over Millbrook with unseasonable fog, transforming familiar streets into something alien and concealing. Ian Martin sat in his car 3 blocks from Thomas Grayson's house, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles showed white through the gloves. He'd been watching the VFW hall for the past hour, waiting for Thomas to emerge. At 9:15 p.m, the door opened and Thomas walked out, calling goodbyes to the other men inside. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd had a few beers but wasn't drunk, steady but slightly slower than usual, concentrating on his steps. Perfect. Ian waited 5 minutes, giving Thomas time to get ahead. Then he started his car and drove the route he'd memorized, parking 3 blocks from Thomas's house in a pool of shadow between streetlights. He took several deep breaths, trying to calm his racing heart, then stepped out into the fog. The walk to Thomas's house felt surreal, like moving through a dream. The fog muffled sounds, turned ordinary homes into ghostly shapes. Ian passed several houses with porch lights on, keeping his head down, looking like any resident out for an evening stroll. No one would remember him. No one would look twice. Thomas's house appeared through the fog, a 3-story Victorian that had seen better days. The front was dark except for the living room, where blue television light flickered. Ian circled around back, moving slowly, checking for neighbours or witnesses. Nothing. Just the fog and the muffled sound of a television playing somewhere nearby. The back door was unlocked. Ian stood in the mudroom for 30 seconds, listening. The television was loud. Local news, some story about traffic improvements. Thomas's voice, talking to himself. Waste of taxpayer money, as usual. Ian's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain Thomas would hear it. But his hands remained steady as he pulled out the nylon rope he'd prepared. He'd practiced this at home, timing himself, making sure he could move quickly enough. The kitchen was dark. Ian moved through it slowly, carefully, testing each step before putting his weight down. Through the doorway, he could see into the living room. Thomas sat in a recliner, his back partially to the kitchen, focused on the television. An empty beer bottle sat on the side table. Thomas had changed into sweatpants and a Vietnam veteran's t-shirt. He looked comfortable, relaxed, utterly unaware that death was walking toward him. He moved fast, dropping the rope over Thomas's head and pulling tight in one smooth motion. Thomas reacted instantly. The soldier's training never truly disappeared. 2 tours in Vietnam had honed reflexes that endured 50 years later. Thomas's hands shot up to the rope, trying to get his fingers underneath. He threw his weight sideways, trying to dislodge Ian. His elbow drove back hard, connecting with Ian's ribs with enough force to make Ian gasp. But Ian held on, tightening the rope, bracing his knee against the back of the chair for leverage. Thomas fought harder than Eleanor had, stronger, more trained. He managed to get one finger under the rope, his nails tearing at the nylon at Ian's gloved hands. His other elbow swung back again, catching Ian in the stomach, driving the breath from his lungs. Ian pulled tighter, tears streaming down his face from the pain of Thomas's struggles. Thomas's feet drummed against the floor, his body bucking violently. His hands clawed at Ian's arms, finding exposed skin above the gloves, gouging deep furrows that made Ian cry out. But Ian held on. 90 seconds that felt like hours. Thomas's movements grew less coordinated, more desperate, then weaker. His hands still clawed, but slower, with less force. His drumming feet stuttered to stillness. Still, Ian held on, remembering his mistake with Eleanor, how he'd thought she was dead when she was only unconscious. He counted to 60, the rope cutting into his gloved hands, Thomas's weight growing heavier as consciousness fled, and then life followed. Finally, Ian released the rope. Thomas slumped in the chair, his head lolling forward, his hands falling to his sides. Ian stepped back, breathing hard, trembling violently. There was blood on his arms where Thomas had scratched him, long furrows that burned. More blood than there should be. Thomas must have torn through skin, maybe hit an artery. Move. He had to move. Ian stumbled to the bathroom, washed the blood from his arms with water so hot it scalded. The scratches were deep, still bleeding freely. He'd have to come up with some story. Maybe he'd slipped working in his yard, fallen into a bush. He wrapped paper towels around his arms, tucking them under his jacket sleeves. Focus. Stage the scene. Back in the living room, Ian forced himself to think. Burglary. Make it look like burglary. He overturned a lamp. The crash made him flinch, but there was no one to hear. He opened drawers in the desk, pulling them out, scattering contents. He took Thomas's wallet from his pants pocket on the floor by the chair, removed the cash, pocketed it. The watch from Thomas's wrist, an old Timex. Nothing valuable. But a burglar wouldn't know that. The back door. Leave it open. Make it clear someone had come in that way. Ian walked through the kitchen again, opened the door wide, then forced himself to walk slowly through the backyard, across to the street, back to his car. The walk felt endless. Every house window seemed to contain watching eyes. Every distant sound became footsteps of discovery. But Ian moved steadily, hands in pockets. Just another person walking on a foggy evening. His car was where he'd left it. Ian got in, started the engine, pulled away at exactly the speed limit. No rushing, no panic. Just a normal drive home. Inside his condo, Ian locked the door and collapsed against it. His whole body convulsed uncontrollably. He could still feel Thomas's struggles, still hear the wet, gurgling sounds as the life left his body. The scratches on his arms throbbed with each heartbeat, painting his jacket sleeves rust-coloured. Ian stripped off his clothes mechanically, putting everything in a garbage bag to dispose of later. He stood in the shower for 30 minutes, watching Thomas's blood spiral down the drain, mixing with his own blood from the scratches. The water turned pink, then clear, but Ian still felt dirty, contaminated, marked. He dressed the scratches with antiseptic and bandages, inventing his cover story as he worked. Fell in the yard, caught on a rosebush. Stupid accident. No one would question it. In his bedroom, Ian poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and drank it in 2 swallows. Then 3 more. The alcohol dulled the shaking, but couldn't touch the images replaying in his mind. Thomas fighting. Thomas weakening. Thomas dying. But beneath the horror, another feeling was growing. Grim satisfaction. It was done. Thomas was dead. The property would come to market within weeks. Probate was fast when there was only one heir, and Thomas's sister would want to liquidate quickly. Ian could approach her before the property was even listed, offer a reasonable cash deal, close fast. He'd clear enough to satisfy his immediate creditors and buy himself another few months. He'd solved the problem. Ian finished the bourbon and climbed into bed, still quivering but functional. Tomorrow he'd dispose of the clothes. Tomorrow he'd perfect his story about the scratches. Tomorrow he'd start planning his approach to Thomas's sister. But tonight he let himself believe that the hardest part was over. He'd killed twice and gotten away with it twice. He was smarter than the police, luckier than he deserved. He could keep doing this, solving problems, eliminating obstacles, surviving.